Some of them were in every single kitchen in America. Today, almost no one under 50 has ever seen them. Think about that for a moment. Not 2 generations ago. Not a distant sepia-toned past that requires imagination to access. We are talking about objects that were so ordinary, so completely expected, so deeply woven into the fabric of daily American life that no one thought to photograph them in context. No one thought to study them. No one wrote about them in the newspaper. Because why would you write about something that was simply there, bolted to the wall, clamped to the counter, hanging from a peg, buried in the back of a drawer that was always slightly sticky, always slightly difficult to open, always rattling with the sound of things made of cast iron and aluminum and Bakelite, things that had real weight, things that were made to last, things that meant something. Do you remember that drawer? Not just what was in it, the drawer itself. The wooden kitchen drawer in a 1960s house, painted over so many times that the paint had built up along the edges into a soft ridge, and you had to give it a little tug to get it started. And then it came out with a rush, and everything inside slid forward and clattered back, and you could hear the clink of metal against metal, the rattle of handles, the soft, dense knock of something heavy resting against something equally heavy. That sound, that particular, specific, completely unrepeatable sound of a kitchen drawer full of real tools. Not plastic, not disposable, not purchased on a whim and forgotten in a month. Actual tools, the kind with weight. That weight was the first thing. Pick up almost any gadget from a 1960s kitchen and the heft of it came to you immediately. The solidity, the sense of mass, the way it sat in your hand like something that had a job to do and knew exactly what that job was. Cast iron with the patina of years. Aluminum thick enough to ring like a small bell if you tapped it. Bakelite handles, smooth, dark, warm from the palm that had held them 10,000 times, fitting into a hand as though they had been shaped there over decades of use. These were objects made to be used without fear of breaking them. They were made to be passed from one generation to the next, carried in boxes during moves, scrubbed in hot soapy water, and put back on the wall or in the drawer without ceremony, without preservation, without the slightest suspicion that one day they would be gone. One of these gadgets was so completely, naturally woven into the daily life of families with children that kids were taught to use it before they could reach the counter without standing on a stool. And yet most people today, people of 40, 35, 30, have never seen one in actual use, have never held one, have never heard the sound it made. We'll come to it, we'll get there. And there was one gadget, beautiful, seasonal, invested with the full ceremony of the holidays, that appeared in nearly every home twice a year. That was as expected at Thanksgiving or Christmas as the good china and the pressed tablecloth. That was used exactly twice a year, always with the same careful ritual, always producing something extraordinary, always put away again in its place above the refrigerator or behind the roasting pan until the next time. We'll come to that one too. But first, pull open the drawer. Listen to it rattle. Close your eyes if you need to. You know that sound. You grew up with it. Let's begin with something you may have walked past 1,000 times without giving it a moment's thought. It was right there on the wall, usually near the main counter, sometimes mounted on the side of a cabinet beneath the sink, always screwed in firmly, at exactly the right height for the person who used it most. It was a permanent fixture of that kitchen, the same way the clock was a fixture, the same way the calendar was a fixture. The wall-mounted, hand-cranked can opener. In the early years of the decade, before electric can openers became affordable enough to be ordinary, the wall-mounted hand-crank model was simply what you used. The swing-away, manufactured in St. Louis, was perhaps the name most people recognized. A heavy, precisely engineered piece of chrome-plated steel with a sharp cutting wheel and a wide, deeply satisfying crank handle that turned with real mechanical resistance and produced real, immediate, visible results. There were others. Rival made a version. Edlund made a commercial-grade model that found its way into some home kitchens. But the swing-away had earned its particular reputation, and it held it. People trusted it the way they trusted a good knife. It cut cleanly. It kept its edge, and it did not break. The can opener's arm swung out from the wall. That was the genius of the design. the feature that gave the swing away its name, pivoting outward to accept the can, locking the cutting wheel into position against the rim, and then rotating as you turned the handle, following the circumference of the can in a smooth, unbroken circle. You held the can with one hand and turned the handle with the other in a steady rotation, and the sound of it was very particular, very specific, a rhythmic, mechanical chewing, efficient and purposeful, punctuated by the faint flex of the lid as the cut completed and the can fell open in your hand. The handle is what you remember, if you remember this tool. Wide, designed for a real grip. Turned so that it fit the palm with the same natural logic as a good door handle. Not a thin, uncomfortable piece of bent wire. Not a plastic knob that wobbled. A genuine handle shaped for work. Your mother turned it without looking, without thinking, while she talked to you, while she watched the stove, while she told your father that dinner would be ready in 20 minutes. The can opener lived on the wall, and when she needed it, her hand went directly to it, the way a practiced hand always finds its tool. Some of those openers were still on the walls of the same kitchens 20 years later, 30 years later, still cutting, still sharp, still reliable. Still the right tool for the job. No one thought it would disappear. It was just there, until it wasn't. Which of these did your mother or grandmother use every single day? By the early 1960s, the hand-cranked meat grinder had been in American kitchens for the better part of a century. It was not a new idea. It was not a fashionable gadget. It was a proven, essential, unquestionable piece of kitchen equipment. And in households where cooking from scratch was not a choice but a way of life, where every pound of meat needed to be stretched as far as it would go, where nothing that could be used was ever thrown away, it was as necessary as the stove. The Enterprise Manufacturing Company had been producing cast iron grinders since the 1800s. The Universal brand was well known. The Griswold name meant cast iron of the highest quality. But whatever name was on the body of the grinder clamped to your grandmother's counter, you knew it the moment you saw it. It clamped to the counter. That was the first action, and it was already satisfying. The wing bolt, a large, thumb-turned screw on the underside of the mounting bracket, was tightened down against the counter edge until the thing was absolutely immovable, a fixture as solid as the counter itself. Then the hopper went on top. A wide-mouth funnel of cast iron, slightly rough to the touch, cool and heavy, that accepted the pieces of meat or bread or whatever needed grinding. The handle attached to the side, connected by a gear to the worm inside, the central component. A continuous spiral of metal that caught the food that fell from the hopper, drew it inward with each rotation, compressed it, and pressed it through a circular die plate punched with small, precise holes. The size of the holes in the die determined the coarseness of the grind. A coarse plate for sausage, a finer plate for meatloaf, the finest plate for the softest things, and the sound. You know the sound. If you ever stood in a kitchen where one of these was working, a grinding, churning, rolling sound, not rough or violent, but sustained and purposeful. The deep mechanical voice of a machine doing exactly what it was designed to do. Pork shoulder went into the hopper in rough chunks, was pressed down by the wooden pusher that came with the grinder, and as the handle began to turn, slowly, steadily, the circular rhythm of the crank arm, the machine accepted the meat and transformed it. Long threads of ground pork emerged from the front of the die plate in a steady, living stream, falling into the bowl positioned beneath. If the meat was well marbled, there was a faint, rich smell of it working through the metal, a warm interior smell, the smell of food being made, of protein and fat being rearranged into something new. If you were the child helping, standing on the stool, reaching for the handle, given the task because a child's hands were needed and because learning to help was part of growing up, you cranked the handle with the enthusiasm that children bring to anything mechanical, the delight of turning something and watching something else happen as a result. And your grandmother, patient, knowing, entirely at home with this work, would put her hand over yours and slow you down. Steady, not so fast. Let it work. Her hand over your smaller hand on the cold iron handle. You can feel that, can't you, even now? The weight of the grinder beneath you both, the resistance in the mechanism, and her hand correcting your grip with the certainty of someone who had done this 1,000 times before you were born. She used it for meatloaf, the weekly meatloaf that was reliable and filling and made 1 pound of ground chuck feed 5 people if you added enough onion and breadcrumb. She used it for stuffed peppers. She used it for the sausages she made every autumn, pork and sage and fennel and crushed red pepper, mixed in a bowl by hand, tasted raw if she was that kind of woman, or cooked first in a small patty to check the seasoning. She used it for chicken croquettes, leftover roast chicken ground fine, and mixed with cream sauce, and formed into little ovals and breaded and fried until golden. She used it to grind stale bread into fresh breadcrumbs. She used it to grind kidney for the pie that only she and her husband had ever truly loved, that she made every February regardless, because he had loved it, and certain things you kept doing because of certain people. The meat grinder did not discriminate. It worked through everything with the same patient, mechanical grace. And when it was done, you reversed the handle a few turns to clear the worm gear, disassembled the die and the blades and the hopper, and washed everything in the hottest water you could stand, dried it carefully to prevent rust, and hung it on the hook on the wall, or put it back in the low cabinet where it lived. The clean metal smelled faintly of iron, that cold, mineral, almost electrical smell of cast iron that has been thoroughly washed. You can still smell it, can't you? That ghost of a machine that worked hard and asked for nothing except to be kept clean. Pull something lighter from the drawer. Something that didn't clamp and didn't grind, but worked with a gentler motion, a softer sound, for a gentler purpose. The squeeze-handle flour sifter had been in American kitchens since the Depression era, when baking from scratch was not a hobby, but a necessity. By the early 1960s, it came in several sizes with a single or double mesh screen, made by Foley or Bromwell or half a dozen other manufacturers whose names are mostly forgotten now. You know the kind. A cylinder of tin, maybe 10 inches tall and 3 cups capacity, with a handle on the side attached to a simple mechanism. When you squeezed the handle, a wire loop swept through the interior and pushed flour through the fine screen at the bottom. Squeeze, release, squeeze, release. The flour fell in a quiet, steady cloud into the bowl below, fine and white and aerated, ready to be worked into batter or biscuit dough, or the layers of a cake that would take 4 hours to make and disappear in 20 minutes. The sound of the sifter was completely unlike the sound of the grinder. Where the grinder was heavy and churning, the sifter whispered. A papery, gentle, almost peaceful sound. The sweep of wire through flour. The soft rush of flour through mesh, interrupted occasionally by the slight click of the handle reaching the limit of its arc. You could hear it from the next room and know that someone was baking. You could hear it on a Saturday morning and know that the day would eventually include something good. If you watched closely while it worked, you could see the fine cloud of flour particles that rose with each squeeze, a brief white mist caught in the kitchen light before settling into the bowl, and it was beautiful in the unpretentious, practical way that functional things done well are always beautiful. The recipe might say to sift the flour 3 times with the baking powder and the salt. So she sifted it 3 times, not because she questioned the recipe, because the recipe was the recipe, tested and trusted, and when it was done, the bowl held something that was already more than flour. It held the beginning of a thing that would, in a few hours, become the reason everyone would remember that particular Saturday afternoon. Your mother's wrist got tired from the squeezing. You may not have noticed it then, if you were young. If you were simply watching her work the way children watch grown-ups do things they cannot quite do themselves. But you might remember it now, the way she switched the sifter to her other hand sometimes, or rested it on the edge of the bowl for just a moment, her wrist flexing slightly, before picking it back up. She never said anything about it. There was nothing to say. The sifter was part of baking. And baking was part of taking care of everyone in the house, and certain kinds of work you simply did without commentary. The paint on the handle, often red or yellow, or the particular shade of green, that was fashionable in kitchen tools in the 1950s, and had simply stayed, wore away first at the pivot point of the squeeze mechanism, where the metal moved against metal with every use, showing bright, uncoated tin beneath. That worn spot was a record of use, a small, visible proof that this tool had been held and squeezed and put to work more times than anyone had ever thought to count. The label, if there still was one, was half peeled. The printing faded almost to illegibility. Foley's quality sifter, or entirely gone, leaving only a ghost of adhesive and the memory of a name that no longer needed to be said. It was kept in the drawer with the other baking tools, or hung on a hook inside the flour cabinet, in the exact spot where a hand could reach it without looking, because a kitchen organized by decades of daily use requires no labels on anything. Now imagine the kitchen in the very early morning, before anyone else has come downstairs. The light is the gray-blue of early day coming through the window above the sink. The house is quiet in the particular way that houses are quiet before the day has started in earnest. Not silent exactly, but still holding its breath. And on the burner, the flame turned low beneath it, sits the stovetop percolator, already warm, already working, already producing the sound that defined every American morning of that era, the soft, rhythmic, deeply domestic blurp and gurgle of coffee, percolating up through the central stem, washing over the basket of grounds, and beginning its slow, darkening cycle. The percolator was not a modern invention by the time the 1960s arrived. It had been in American kitchens in some form since the turn of the century, but in the 1960s it was everywhere, and it came in its finest forms. Corningware made a stovetop version in their famous Spice of Life pattern, blue herbs on white pyrocerum, a material that could go from freezer to flame without cracking, a material that felt almost miraculous. Pyrex made a flameware version with an entirely glass body, transparent, so you could watch the coffee inside changing, watch the color deepen from pale gold to amber to a deep mahogany as the basket of grounds was cycled over and over again. Aluminum models were the most common, lightweight, inexpensive, durable almost to the point of indestructibility, and they came in sizes from the small 2-cup model that one person made for themselves on a quiet morning to the massive 12-cup version that came out for Sunday company. The glass knob on top was the thing you watched, a small dome of heat-proof glass set into the center of the lid. It allowed the coffee that was pumping up through the stem to pass through the knob and fall back into the basket. And by watching the color of the liquid in that tiny window, you knew exactly where you were in the cycle. Pale meant early. Deep brown meant soon. Almost black meant now. Turn it down, another 2 minutes. Your mother, or your father, if your father was the coffee maker, had learned to read that knob the way a baker learns to read the color of a crust, not with a timer, not with a thermometer, but with eyes trained by repetition, by the specific education of doing the same thing every morning for years. The smell. There is no adequate description of the smell of percolated coffee in a 1960s kitchen, because description is inadequate to smells that are also memories. But you know it, the particular rich, slightly scorched, densely mineral smell of Folgers, or Maxwell House or Hillsbrosers. Ground coffee cycling through an aluminum pot on a blue gas flame, with the faint additional note of steam rising into a kitchen that smelled of sleep and the beginning of the day. It was the smell of safety. The smell of a house where someone who loved you had gotten up before you and started something warm. Your father drank it black, 2 sugars. Your mother added milk, or condensed milk from the can she had opened an hour earlier. The children were not allowed coffee, but they were given the proximity to its smell, which was its own kind of nourishment. Here is the gadget that children were taught to use before they could reach the counter without a stool. The hand-crank rotary egg beater, 2 sets of interlocking wire loops mounted on a central shaft, connected by a small gear train to a handle that, when cranked in one direction, turned both sets of beaters in opposite directions simultaneously. A piece of mechanical elegance so simple and so effective that it worked in 1920, and it worked in 1965, and it works today, if you still have one. The Echo Company made some of the most widely known versions. A&J was another reliable name. The Androck Company. The handle was almost always wood, turned on a lathe. Smooth and warm from years of being held, or hard plastic in a color that had been chosen sometime in the mid-1950s, and was now simply the color of the tool, red or yellow or a shade of green that looked perpetually cheerful. The gears that drove the beaters were nickel-plated or chrome, and they meshed with a precision that produced a sound almost musical in its regularity. A soft, rapid clicking, steady and confident, the exact sound of something working well. A child could use this. That was its particular genius and its particular charm, and the reason it was the gadget that passed most naturally from adult hands to smaller ones. The motion required was not complicated. One hand gripped the long handle to steady the tool against the bowl. The other hand turned the crank, and the crank was simply a circle, the same motion as turning a bicycle pedal, a motion every child understood by instinct. You put the beaters down into the bowl of egg whites, 4 large eggs, separated with the careful patience of a woman who had learned to do this perfectly, and you cranked. The beaters spun in their interlocking pattern, cutting through the whites, pulling air into them, and the sound changed as they thickened. First a watery splashing, then a softer, fuller sound. Then something almost like the sound of stiff cloth, moving through stiff cloth as the whites became thick and glossy, and began to hold peaks. Your grandmother stood beside you. She was not watching you the way a teacher watches a student, with evaluation, with the weight of judgment. She was watching the egg whites. She knew from the sound and from the way the beaters moved through the bowl when it was almost time. And she would say, "Not yet, a little longer, keep going, and then, that's it, stop." And you lifted the beaters from the bowl, and a peak of white stood up and curled at the very tip, perfect and self-contained. And the feeling was not the small feeling of having done a small thing. It was the real feeling of having learned something that mattered, of having done work with your hands that produced a visible, beautiful result. The rotary egg beater was the gadget most likely to travel between generations intact, light enough to pack in any box, needing no electricity, no special conditions, no instructions. It worked in any kitchen, on any counter, in any decade. And so it moved, from the grandmother's kitchen to the mother's kitchen, packed carefully among the dish towels, arriving in a new house, still working, still turning, still making those precise, quiet, mechanical sounds that meant someone was making something from scratch. You might have held one of these. You might have been the child who cranked it, who was trusted with it, who felt the resistance of egg whites thickening beneath the spinning wires and understood, in the wordless way that children understand things, that you were being taught something important. Do you still have one of these in a drawer somewhere, saved not because you use it, but because you cannot bear to let it go? Step away from the baking now. It is July, a Saturday afternoon in 1964, or 1966, or 1968, somewhere in the warm center of that decade, in a kitchen with the windows open and a box fan at the end of the counter pushing the hot afternoon air around without doing much to cool it. Someone is making a pitcher of lemonade, squeezing real lemons, one at a time, with the glass juicer that sits on the counter beside the sugar and the water. Or someone is making the punch for the gathering that's about to start. The gathering of cousins and neighbors that happens every summer without formal invitation, because everyone knows it happens every summer. And for any of this, for the summer drinking that required crushed ice, because cubed ice was not enough in July, because what the lemonade needed was the kind of cold that only crushed ice could provide. There was the hand-cranked ice crusher. The ice crusher was often mounted on the wall, screwed in beside the refrigerator or on the side of a cabinet, at a height that worked for the person who used it most. Some came with a clamp that attached to the counter edge the same way the meat grinder did. The body was aluminum or chrome-plated steel, the hopper at the top wide enough to accept a full ice cube from the tray. The crank handle on the side exactly the same circular motion as every other crank in the kitchen. Inside, a pair of serrated steel rollers waited, and when you dropped an ice cube into the hopper and turned the crank, those rollers grabbed the cube and crushed it with a sound that was startling and deeply satisfying, a splintering, grinding crunch that you felt in your back teeth as much as you heard it with your ears. Crushed ice fell from the bottom of the machine in a spray of cold, shards and powder mixed together, imperfect, inconsistent, exactly right. Children cranked the ice crusher the way they cranked everything else, with the same circular enthusiasm, the same pride of participation. the same awareness that they were doing something real with a real tool, and the ice piled up in the bowl or the pitcher, bright and cold. And someone handed you the first glass of lemonade made with ice you had crushed yourself, and you drank it, and it was perfect. Not because lemonade made with hand-crushed ice is chemically superior to lemonade made any other way, but because your hands had made it, and nothing tastes the way it does when your hands have made it. Just before the ice crusher, though, before the crushed ice was possible, there was the ice itself. There was the aluminum ice cube tray with the lever handle, and if you grew up in any American home in the 1960s, you know this object with a completeness and immediacy that requires no description, though it deserves one. A long, shallow aluminum tray, the metal dull and slightly cold, to the look even before you touched it, divided into sections by a removable grid of metal strips, with a lever handle running across the top that, when you pulled it up and back, flexed the grid against the bottom of the tray and cracked every cube loose simultaneously, all at once, with a sound that was one of the defining sounds of that kitchen, of that house, of that entire era of domestic life. The crack. There is no other word for it, and no substitute for the sound itself. Not a gentle release, not a quiet pop, a definite, sharp, resonant crack, metallic and immediate, and satisfying in the specific way that things working exactly as designed are satisfying. You pulled the tray from the freezer. It was frosted on the outside, slightly painful to hold with bare, wet hands, the kind of cold that made itself known instantly, and you held it over the sink or over the ice bucket, and you pulled the lever up and back, and the kitchen rang with that sound. Crack, pop. The cubes shifted, freed from their compartments, tumbling into whatever waited below, cold and clear and perfectly formed, 12 or 14 of them, each one a small square miracle of frozen water. There was, in almost every family that had these trays for any length of time, one tray with a small dent in the side, a spot where it had been dropped on the kitchen floor sometime in 1962 or 1963 or some other year that nobody remembered precisely, when it hit the linoleum and dented but did not break, because it was aluminum, and aluminum could be dented without losing its function, and so it went back in the freezer, dented, and stayed there for years. The dent was not a flaw. It was a record, a small, physical memory of one specific moment in the life of an object that had already been used thousands of times and would be used thousands of times more. No one repaired it. No one replaced it on account of a dent. That was not how things worked then. That was not the relationship between people and their tools. Nobody kept one of these when the automatic ice maker arrived. Why would you? It was just a tray. It was just ice. And yet, the specific cold weight of that aluminum in your hands, the specific resistance of the lever, the specific sound of the crack, these were part of a kitchen that was alive, that was working, that was being used every day by people who knew how everything in it functioned and could make it function, and did. Come back from the cold now. It is Sunday. Early afternoon, and the roast has been in the oven since noon, beef or chicken or pork, depending on the week, depending on the budget, depending on who was coming. And the house has had the smell of it for hours, the deep, enclosed, working smell of protein and fat cooking, slowly in a closed space. The smell that was the smell of Sunday in 1,000 American homes. The potatoes have been boiling for 30 minutes in salted water on the front burner, and they are done. And the grandmother lifts the pot to the sink and drains them through the colander. And then, steam rising from the colander, the kitchen suddenly warmer and fuller with the smell of boiled potato. She reaches into the cabinet for the potato ricer. Cast aluminum, most commonly. Long handles that worked like a pair of large scissors, coming together at the pivot to compress the perforated cup that hung between them. Inside the cup, a flat disc could be pressed down against the potato by the force of squeezing the handles together. She put a hot, cooked potato in the cup, using a folded dish towel to protect her hands from the steam, and pressed the handles together firmly. And the potato, under steady pressure, extruded through the small round holes of the cup in dozens of thin, even threads, falling into the bowl below in a loose, fluffy mound that looked almost like fresh snow. Then she pressed another potato, and another, until the bowl was full. What the ricer did, that nothing else could do, was honor the structure of the potato. The electric mixer, when everyone eventually got one, worked potatoes fast and made them smooth in a different way. Worked the starch, drove the air in rather than letting it settle, and often produced, if you weren't careful, a dense and slightly gluey result that was edible but missed the point. The ricer simply pressed the potato through without working it, without overhandling it, without disturbing its essential nature more than necessary. The result was the lightest, creamiest, most perfectly textured mashed potato possible, a bowl of something that tasted, unambiguously, of potato and butter and the specific skill of a woman who knew how to use her tools. Butter went in first. Real butter, a generous amount. Added while the potatoes were still steaming hot, so it melted immediately and disappeared into the threads before you could see it go. Then cream, or whole milk if the week called for milk rather than cream, salt, white pepper. In some kitchens, because some grandmothers had always used white pepper in mashed potatoes, and that was the rule of their kitchens, absolute and non-negotiable, and the question of why white pepper and not black was a question no one asked, because some things just were the way they were. More butter, because more butter was always correct. And then it was done, smooth and rich and golden from the butter, and fragrant with the steam of it, and it was carried to the table where the roast already waited, and no one said anything about it except to have more. From the drawer now, something seasonal, something that carried its own particular anticipation in the weight of it, the rattle of the small tin that traveled with it wherever it went. The cookie press, a metal tube, perhaps 12 inches long, substantial in the hand, with a piston mechanism at the rear, driven by a trigger or a large rotating knob, and at the front, a fitting designed to accept interchangeable discs, small, flat, circular pieces of metal, each with a different pattern cut through it. A Christmas tree shape, a star, a wreath with 5 points of detail, a flower, a spritz cookie design that was really just a series of lines radiating outward into something simultaneously simple and elegant. These discs came in their own small tin, and the tin had a particular rattle. Disc against the inside of the lid. That was the sound of a specific season beginning. The Miro Aluminum Company made the press that most people knew best. Miro, based in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, whose name appeared on aluminum bakeware in kitchens across the country. The Wherever brand made a version as well. The Miro cookie press was a tool that inspired, in the people who used it, a combination of practical admiration and genuine affection, because it did what it promised, and it did it reliably. It produced uniform, precise, beautifully shaped cookies from a batch of spritz dough, butter and sugar and eggs and flour and almond extract, worked to the exactly right consistency, cold enough to hold its shape through the die, but warm enough to flow without cracking. The batch was loaded into the tube through the open rear end. The chosen disc was fitted and locked into the front. The press was held flat against the baking sheet. The trigger was pulled, and the dough was extruded in one smooth motion through the disc. The sound of the press was a soft, definite clunk, mechanical, decisive, with each pull of the trigger. Clunk. A star appeared on the sheet, perfect and butter yellow. Clunk. Another. A third. You pressed 12 to a sheet, worked 2 or 3 sheets per batch, and the cookies baked in a moderate oven for 10 to 12 minutes until the edges were barely beginning to color and the centers were still pale and soft. Then they came out and cooled on the rack and hardened slightly and became the specific, impossible thing that spritz cookies are. Tender and crisp at once, rich with butter, with the almond extract lingering in a way that was not overpowering but was absolutely unmistakably there. It is almost impossible to think about the cookie press without thinking about December. It came out of its place on the high shelf in the first or second week of December, and the choosing of the disc was a ceremony performed by the children with complete seriousness, debated with the full weight of childish conviction. The Christmas tree. Know the star, know the wreath, and finally, a decision rendered by the grandmother, who settled the question with the calm authority of someone who had been settling such questions for 40 years. The oven was preheated. The dough was cold from the refrigerator, and the kitchen filled with the smell of butter and almond, and the particular sweetness of raw sugar, and the tree in the living room was not yet decorated, but the house already knew it was Christmas. The handwritten recipe card. This detail stops time completely. In some kitchens, in many kitchens, the recipe for spritz cookies was written on an index card in someone's handwriting. The specific proportions that worked with the Miro press, the note about chilling the dough before pressing, the reminder not to grease the sheet. It was written in the handwriting of a woman who is gone now, a handwriting that was ordinary when it was made and is now irreplaceable. The card lived in the drawer with the press. It might have a smear of butter on one corner, a faint ghost of flour on the back. You may have it still, somewhere, in a box of papers from the old house, among things you kept without quite being able to explain why. If you do, take it out, look at the handwriting, and remember the hands that wrote it. And now, the gadget used exactly twice a year, without fail, with the specific ceremony it deserved. The jell-o mold, the aspic mold, or, in the kitchens of the women who took this seriously, who had learned the art of it from their own mothers and maintained it with pride, the ornate copper or aluminum ring mold, shaped like a crown or a bunt or a fish or a castle tower, with ridges and patterns in the metal walls that would transfer perfectly to whatever was set inside, producing a finished form that was as precise and as decorative as anything that came out of that kitchen. The copper ones were something beyond ordinary. They had the weight of something genuinely valuable, and a patina that accumulated with careful use and careful polishing, the particular dark amber of copper that has been worked with. That has been brought back to brightness again and again at the sink, with a paste of salt and vinegar, or the special copper cleaner kept under the sink for exactly this purpose. The places where the copper was darkest were the corners of the design, the recesses where polishing couldn't reach perfectly, and this contrast between the bright surfaces and the darker recesses made the mold look ancient, crafted, important, which it was in its own way. Some women hung their copper molds on the kitchen wall, arranged by size, decorative even when at rest. And then, at the right time of year, at the holidays, at Easter, at the big family dinner that required something from the mold, they came down from the wall. What went into the mold varied entirely by family and by occasion. The simplest and most universal version, lime or lemon, jell-o, dissolved in boiling water, cooled until it was syrupy and just beginning to thicken, with fruit suspended throughout. Mandarin orange segments, maraschino cherries, crushed pineapple from a can, or sliced peaches, arranged in the mold before the jell-o set so they would appear embedded in the finished form. Then into the refrigerator overnight. Then, the next day at the moment of service, the great unmolding. This was a small domestic drama. The mold came from the refrigerator, already inverted on a plate, or the grandmother held the plate against the mold with both hands and inverted the whole assembly in a single smooth motion, and then, patience, stillness, the very briefest held breath shared around the table. She lifted the mold away. If she had done it correctly, if the jell-o had set firmly enough, if the mold had been properly oiled or wetted before filling, there was a soft, low, pneumatic sound as the vacuum released, a gentle sucking inhale, and then the mold came away clean, and the form stood on the plate wobbling slightly. Every ridge and pattern of the mold transferred faithfully into translucent green or red. Perfectly shaped, cool, and improbable, a triumph of domestic engineering. The moment of successful unmolding was a kind of collective relief around the table, something close to brief, quiet applause. The satisfaction of a thing done correctly by someone who knew how to do it. And if it didn't work, if the jell-o had set too loosely, if the mold hadn't been prepared quite right, there was a moment of renegotiation, of quick thinking, of pouring it back and calling it a gelatin salad in a bowl instead, and presenting it with the same confidence, because a woman who had managed a household for 30 years did not lose her poise over jell-o. She adapted and moved on. The mold was stored above the refrigerator or behind the roasting pan, wrapped in a dish towel, and it came out exactly twice a year. No more and no less. And it was as expected at those occasions as the good silver and the pressed tablecloth. It appeared at every holiday, in every home, and was used twice a year without fail. Think about when you last saw someone make a jell-o mold at a family gathering. Think about when you last saw one of those copper ring molds on the wall of a kitchen that wasn't a museum, and then think about what that means, because it means something. This is the question that runs beneath all of these objects, all of these memories, all of this weight and sound and smell. When did all of this disappear from our kitchens, and what replaced it that weighs so little, breaks so easily, and is thrown away without a thought? It didn't vanish overnight. Nothing of consequence disappears all at once. The electric can opener arrived in the 1950s, but the wall-mounted hand crank model stayed on the wall anyway, because the electric one was extra, an addition, a convenience, but not a replacement for something that had always worked. The stand mixer arrived, and the rotary egg beater stayed in the drawer, because the mixer was large and required setup, and the egg beater was right there, in your hand, already doing the job. The drip coffee machine replaced the electric percolator, which had already replaced the stovetop percolator, and in that sequence of replacements, the morning ritual changed, and the smell changed. And something that had been a slow, attended, sensory experience became a timed, automatic process that required nothing from the person standing in the kitchen except patience for the machine to finish. The electric ice crusher replaced the manual one. The freezer door began dispensing ice directly, cube or crushed. The aluminum tray went into a box, and the box went to the garage, and the garage sale. And someone bought it for 50 cents and hung it in their kitchen, not because they needed ice, but because it looked charming. Decoration. The word itself is the epitaph, because these things were not decoration. They were work. They were the daily, skilled, physical work of women who cooked every single day, who made everything from scratch, not as a hobby or a statement of values, but because that was what feeding a family required, who understood their tools with an intimacy that came from years of daily use, the specific pressure needed on the ricer handle, the exact sound of the percolator at the right moment, the feel of spritz dough at the correct temperature before pressing. This was not knowledge that could be looked up. It was knowledge that lived in hands and in ears, and in the particular calibration of a woman's attention to the work in front of her. The kitchens of the 1960s are discussed sometimes as a kind of cheerful cultural artifact, bright with primary colors, full of new convenience foods. The site of a domestic revolution in which technology was liberating women from the drudgery of traditional cooking. And there is truth in that story. There was liberation in some of those technologies. There was real relief in some of those conveniences. But there was also a workshop, an actual functioning workshop that existed in those kitchens, in which real skill was applied to real ingredients by real hands using real tools, and in which that work was transmitted from one generation to the next by watching and by doing, by the hand placed over a smaller hand on the handle of a meat grinder, by the instruction to keep cranking, not yet a little longer. That transmission was not just the transfer of a technique, it was the transfer of a relationship to food, to making, to the idea that the things you ate should be, connected to the hands that prepared them. Maybe yours was still in the drawer, long after it stopped being used. Maybe you kept the egg beater when you could have easily thrown it away, and you kept it not because you planned to use it, but because it was hers, and her hands had held it. And there was no way to explain that to anyone who asked. Maybe the flour sifter is in a box in the basement, the red handle, the label half gone, and you haven't thought about it in years, and now you are thinking about it. Maybe the copper jell-o mold is on a shelf somewhere in your kitchen right now, beautiful and untouched, because you couldn't bring yourself to let it go when you cleared her house. If you still have one of these, any of them, take it out, hold it. Feel the weight of it in your hand. Turn the handle if it has one, squeeze the grip if it has one, lift it and feel the specific, irreplaceable heft of a thing built to be used by human hands for human purposes. Close your eyes, you can hear it. The wooden drawer rattling open, the clamp of the meat grinder biting down on the counter edge, the whisper of flour through mesh, the early morning gurgle of the percolator, the soft, musical clicking of the egg beater's gears, the splintering crunch of ice, The definite crack of an aluminum tray releasing its cubes, the soft clunk of the cookie press, the barely audible pneumatic sigh of a copper mold lifting clean from a jell-o that set perfectly overnight. The mechanical, even, quietly dignified sound of a wall-mounted can opener, cutting a clean circle through tin. These were not just gadgets. They were not charming relics of a simpler time. They were the instruments of a specific, daily, unannounced love. The kind that expressed itself not in words, but in the work of feeding people you cared for, every single day, without recognition, without ceremony, without the expectation of applause. Every pull of the sifter handle, every rotation of the grinder, every ice tray cracked open for the summer drinks, every batch of spritz cookies pressed onto the baking sheet in December, every Sunday mashed potato passed through the ricer while the roast rested on the counter. Every morning percolator left on the low burner so the coffee would be ready. These were acts of care performed in the quiet of a kitchen that smelled of coffee and butter and the beginning of something good. The tools are mostly gone. The kitchens that held them are mostly gone. The women who used them, patient and skilled and largely uncelebrated, are mostly gone too. But your hands remember, and the memory of a pair of hands, the specific weight they held, the specific sounds they made, the specific love they expressed through the work they did every single day, is not a small thing. It is, in fact, almost everything.